All right, so we are now streaming on YouTube. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us this evening. This is John with Murder by the Book, coming to you with another virtual event. I feel like it's been like forever since I've done one of these because I think the last one I did was like 2 weeks ago. So it's exciting to be back and being able to do these again. We're really excited tonight to have Brian Freeman here with us. He's going to be talking about his newest release, The Deep, Deep Snow. And we're also happy to have Jeffrey Fleishman with us, and he's going to be talking to us about his new novel, The Last Dance. I'm sorry, just Last Dance. So let me get these guys introduced so we can get started. Brian Freeman is the New York Times bestselling author of psychological thrillers, including the Jonathan Stride and Frost Easton series. His books have been sold in 46 countries and 22 languages. He is widely acclaimed for his You Are There settings and his complex, engaging characters and twist-filled plots. Brian's novel, Spilled Blood, won the award for Best Hardcover Novel in the annual Thriller Awards given out by the International Thriller Writers Organization, and his fifth novel, The Burying Place, was a finalist for the same award. He has been selected as the author to continue Robert Ludlum's Jason Bourne series and his new Bourne novel, The Bourne Evolution, released in 2020. If you guys want to hear Brian chat about that one, scroll back through our YouTube videos. We had a really great chat with him and Joshua Hood earlier this year, so you can check that out on YouTube. Most recently out from Brian Freeman are a standalone novel, The Deep, Deep Snow, which we'll be talking about tonight, and a new book in the Jonathan Stride series, Funeral for a Friend. How are you tonight, Brian?
I'm doing great. Great to be back with you again.
It's good to see you again. We were just talking about before we got started that we chatted with him earlier this summer, and it feels like that was kind of a lifetime ago. But we're excited to have you back here with us again.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and we're also joined, as I mentioned, by Jeffrey Fleishman, who is a Pulitzer Prize finalist and a long-term foreign correspondent. He has had postings in Rome, Berlin, Cairo, and has covered wars in Iraq, Libya, and Kosovo. He returned to America in 2014 and is now foreign editor of the Los Angeles Times. He is the author of Shadow Man, Promised Virgins, My Detective, which was the first in his Sam Carver series, and most recently, Last Dance, which we'll be talking about tonight, which is the newest in the Sam Carver series. How are you tonight, Jeffrey?
Fine, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us. So to get us started, Brian, do you want to tell us a little bit about the new book?
Yeah, well, the Deep, Deep Snow, for a lot of years, readers have been asking me, what's your favorite book of everything you've written? And I've always struggled with that question because I think I'm up to 22, 23 books now, and I love each of the books for very different reasons. And yet I'm finally at a point of saying, I really believe that at least to date, The Deep, Deep Snow is my own personal favorite of anything that I've done. I mean, people who read my books know that I like to write very, very intense emotional kinds of thrillers. And The Deep, Deep Snow really is exactly what I like to bring to readers. It's very character driven. It's a mystery with lots of twists and turns. And yet at its core, it's all about the relationships of the characters. And this was a very different experience for me because it's not only written in the first person, and this was the first time that I'd done that in any of my mysteries, but it uses a female protagonist. Shelby Lake is a young sheriff's deputy that narrates the book, and it was just a fascinating creative experience for me to sort of get to know Shelby and write through her eyes. It's almost as if she had to reach a level of trust with me to let me tell her story, and so I just really love this book. It took a lot of risks for me. It spread out over 10 years, which is always a narrative choice that can create problems for you. And it deals with a lot of tough issues from dementia in Shelby's father to the disappearance of the child that's sort of at the heart of the mystery. It was actually inspired by a true case in Minnesota that was sort of a case that really obsessed the state for a lot of years. And in fact, it was not solved when I was working on the case, but working on the book, but it was solved shortly after I had finished the manuscript. But I wanted to kind of sort of create some justice for this mystery, but do it in a way that didn't have sort of a violent, explicit conclusion. So I hope readers really embrace the way I pull this together.
Thank you. And so, Jeffrey, do you want to tell us a little bit about the Sam Carver series and the new book, Last Dance?
Yes, the Sam Carver series began last year with the publication of My Detective, and it's when Sam Carver was investigating the murder of architects in a reborn Los Angeles. Los Angeles was going through a renaissance, and architects were being murdered, and the murderer was Dylan Cross, an architect who was seeking vengeance, and that led to the Last Dance. That ended, and Carver was onto a new crime, the death of a ballerina in a downtown Los Angeles law. But Dylan Cross continues to haunt that novel, and so she lives on in that one, in at the edges anyway. But I wanted to use this novel. To me, was two things, and it was my further exploration of Los Angeles, which I moved here 7 years ago when I returned from the States, or when I turned from overseas, and I find the city ever elusive in trying to categorize and put some definition on. So much has been written about it. And I found that the best way to come at it is just look at it differently every day and don't try to define it. And through doing that, you'll come up with things, hopefully, that matter about it. And the second thing I wanted to accomplish in this book was use my foreign correspondent background and move the book out of Los Angeles briefly to Europe, to Africa, where Carver is led on the death of a Russian ballerina who has some diaries that a lot of people want to know about, including Russians connected to Putin, and what happened to her. And there's a famous Hollywood producer in it who has former KGB ties. So all of this is sort of stirred into what is behind this, the death of this woman. And it kind of, as I said, it takes place in 3 or 4 different locales, but mainly rooted in Los Angeles.
And so I wanted to mention, if you guys are watching at home on YouTube, if you have questions for either author, drop those in the chat. We will leave some time and we will get to those in just a little bit. So Brian, I wanted to ask you, so the new book, Deep, Deep Snow, was originally a audio original and is now available in print. So knowing that it was originally going to be an audio, did that affect the way that you were writing it? And when you were releasing it as print, did you go back and tweak anything to make it work better for print versus audio?
Oh, interesting. That's a great question. It definitely shaped the creative process. I mean, I essentially wrote the book out loud because I knew that right from the get-go, it was going to be narrated, and I was always conscious of how it was going to be heard and how the prose was going to sound to people as they listened to it. And I think that involved both sort of a different approach to the prose style itself, and even just sort of little things about, you know, how you make chapter breaks and how you make breaks within that, so that readers don't sort of lose track of where they are in the telling of the story. So yeah, it was definitely a different creative process. I actually really enjoyed the idea of kind of writing the book out loud, and I've actually kind of done the same thing with the book since then, even though they've been going straight to print. I honestly did not change the book at all when it came into a print form, and I think there's just kind of a synergy that goes with that. I mean, I think that if you can hear the prose as you're reading it, you know, out loud, it's also going to read well for the reader as it kind of flows into their mind. So that's one of the reasons I've enjoyed kind of taking that same approach in my later books. I like the idea of kind of hearing the book as I write it.
Awesome. And then Brian mentioned this a little bit before we officially got started. But so Jeffrey, I also wanted to ask you, having a background in journalism and editing, how does that influence your fiction writing? And as Brian mentioned before, how does that kind of help or hinder when you're writing fiction?
I think the positive thing about it, the strength you get from that, is the level of detail, the accumulation of facts, and just absorbing information, which is a journalist's trade and craft, of course, and compiling, discerning what's strong, what's not, what can be delineated, what can be cut. So as a storytelling device, when you're looking at it, like when I'm editing other people's copy, I see that right away. But when you're editing your own, it's a little different. You want to hang on to certain things. You want to say, well, maybe I can get this to work. So, but I think the number one thing, I think Ernest Hemingway said the best thing for a novelist to have, and as a journalist, but the second best thing is to know when to get out of journalism. Because at some point you need to set the imagination free. And I think the very positive thing that allows a journalist, I think, to cross over into being a novelist is what I mentioned earlier, the discerning, the gathering of facts, the clear-eyed vision that you can take on things. The downside could be, and you're always pulling yourself against this, is that you're constricting your imagination. You have to keep pushing out at the box and say, okay, I've gathered these instances, I've gathered these details, but I can take them anywhere I want. I'm God at this point. I'm not constrained to the facts. I'm constrained to the facts of my own making, which are, limitless. But sometimes it's hard for the journalist's mind to get out of that. So I find myself always pushing against that. And when you do it, though, it's a nice give and take, because there's always a little voice saying, well, maybe you're going too far, which is good, but you don't want that voice getting too loud either.
Yeah, those are a couple of great points. I always, whenever I'm editing, I always think about my grandfather, because when I was growing up, he used to tell me, you should always let your worst enemy prune your apple tree.
Right.
And I always think about that, because there's so much great material there that you want to leave in, and you just sort of, it's easy to fall in love with your prose, and I always remember that and try to think, what, if it's not advancing the characters, if it's not advancing the story, you have to be willing to cut it, even if it's some great language that you'd love to have in the book. So I think that ruthlessness of being able to sort of make decisions about what works and what doesn't is really important. And I think the research is a similarly good point, because it can be easy to kind of fall in love with research and to sort of really kind of get sucked into things that the author may find fascinating, but that again aren't necessarily advancing the story or the characters, and finding kind of that right balance of how much detail that you include because you're fascinated by the subject versus what's really moving along the pace. That's that delicate balancing act.
Right. It's always in the service of the reader. And I think as young journalists starting out, I'd write my copy and I thought, oh, this is it, this is great. And then the red marks would come out, the pens would fly. And you realize that, as you were saying, Brian, the story has to be propelled. You have to go A, B, C, and D. At the same time, you can have the language that's evocative and provocative at sometimes, but the story can't stop moving.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So going with that, I don't remember who said, one of the authors that we talked to kind of in the store said kind of the best kind of research that you see in a novel is that stuff that like you don't realize that authors are kind of putting in all of that research stuff, and it just kind of flows. So at what point do you know when like to stop researching and you can start writing, and how do you figure out, you mentioned kind of serving the story, how do you figure out kind of how much detail to put in a story to educate people so they know what you're talking about, but without overwhelming them? Let's start with Brian.
Yeah, as I say, it's kind of a balancing act. One of the things that I do is I actually don't like to do a lot of research before I start, unless it's sort of germane to setting up the elements of the plot. I like to actually wait until I'm getting to individual chapters where questions start coming up and settings start coming to the fore, and it's sort of like when I'm in the moment of that particular chapter, that's when I really like to sort of explore and research and find out what I'm dealing with, as opposed to doing a lot of that in advance. Because again, I want to be focused on the nuts and bolts of the story and the characters, and then I want the research to sort of act like decorating the house and getting the blinds up and getting the right paint choices. But I want to wait until I've kind of got that in place before I start working on that.
Yeah, I operate in a very similar way. Even in my reporting, when I was writing, when I sat down to write the lead of a story, the first 5 or 6 graphs, I wouldn't want to look at my notes. I'd want that to be in my head, because if it's in my head and I'm recalling it, that's going to be the most interesting thing to the reader. I'll get to the other stuff as the paragraphs unwind, and I need to check on this fact and this fact. But I don't want too much research to cloud the flow of the narrative thought, because I'd rather put the research in later than be research top heavy and then get drowned out too much. I know some people work opposite way, but
Sure.
I think Brian and I work similarly that way.
Yeah, I think that for me, that's been true of characters as well. I mean, I've got my Jonathan Stride series, which is a long running series, Funeral for a Friend. I think it's the 10th book in that series, and I end up having a lot of readers asking, well, do you kind of keep a notebook of details and facts about the characters that you've had along the way, so that you don't accidentally get something wrong about a particular character or some detail about who they are. And I always say, I probably should do that, but I deliberately don't want to, because I don't want the characters to feel like they're simply sort of two-dimensional compendiums of facts and figures that I'm lifting off a page. I want them to feel human and real and three-dimensional, and if that means every now and then I make a mistake about something, I'd sort of rather do that than feel like the characters don't sort of have that basic humanness about them.
Yeah, I agree. And the other thing about it too is that I think in every book, and Brian, you've written many more than I have, but in every book there's a character you're not expecting to take over, who all of a sudden becomes the love interest of your writing life. And it might be a minor character, but it's just the way they come. And if you're not open to opening that window on that character, and you think you've got a pile of research and this character doesn't fit into it, then you might kill off some really good characters before they have a chance to breathe. And so
yeah, no, that is absolutely right. And and I can do background sketches about the characters before I start, and it doesn't matter how detailed I get. Once they start appearing on the page and coming to life, they start taking me in directions that I didn't anticipate, and I learn things about them that I didn't know when I was trying to envision them before the manuscript came about. By the way, John, I love the little tale that's been going around.
Yesterday we're doing a series of Advent book recommendation videos, and yesterday while I was trying to film them, like the cats were playing with every toy that makes noise. I was trying to film a video next to the tree. One of them was climbing up in the tree while it was happening. It was just a disaster. So they're always interested when I'm sitting here talking to the computer. So Brian, you mentioned kind of having kind of this wide range of characters that you write, and you've had 4 books out this year. Is that right? Is it 4?
Well, technically, yeah, because the Deep Deep Snow came out in print for the first time this year. There was 3 original books, but then the Deep Deep Snow sort of became a 4th launch. So yeah, it's been a crazy year, that's for sure.
I think that qualifies as an army of characters, doesn't it? A legion of characters, maybe.
Oh, yeah. I'm wrapping up my 3rd book writing this year, so next year is going to be the same thing. So yeah, it's been pretty wild. Honestly, you'd never hear anyone say this, but sort of thank heavens for COVID, because all I could do was stay home and write. So.
So as you're sitting down working on a new project, do you approach a Stride novel differently than you approach a Ludlum or a standalone?
Yeah, absolutely. It's for like a Stride series, because I've known those characters for so many years. Honestly, the first thing I do when I'm thinking about a new Stride novel is I kind of just map out where each of those characters is in their lives, and I start thinking about what their current challenges are and where they might go next, and what happened to them in the last book. I never like to plan out the series too far ahead, because where those characters are kind of depends on what happens to them in each book. And so, based on what's going on in Funeral for a Friend, that's obviously going to have a big impact on what happens next for Stride, because of a lot of things that happened in that book. So I kind of start with the characters for a series novel. When it comes to something like Bourne, which is sort of more action driven and less character driven, I'm thinking about how to evolve the characters, but I'm also thinking sort of more big picture and thinking of the way Ludlum would approach books, and be thinking about sort of what the trends are in society that would sort of make interesting subthreads. So in the BOURNE Evolution, there's a lot of information about big tech and sort of tech conspiracies and things, and as it happened, that all ended up feeling very timely with what was going on this year. So I think it tends to be a little bit more plot focused in something like a Bourne book. And then if I'm doing a standalone, that's kind of, unique to each story that I may want to tell. And normally the characters and plot kind of evolve hand in hand as I'm putting it together.
And then, so Jeffrey, for you, so you had, before you started the Sam Carver series, you had written a couple of standalone novels and then are now doing a series character. So what made you decide to want to do a series?
My first two novels weren't crime or mystery. They were more more literary fiction, I guess. And I was sitting in LA, and after moving back, I'd been here a few years, and I was kicking around an idea for books I wanted to do. And I thought, well, a lot of my formation of my love for noir and crime fiction came not first from books, but from old Humphrey Bogart movies and so my sensibilities around the genre were formed that way. And I thought, well, I'm in Los Angeles, the seedbed of noir. Let me try my hand at this. So I was living right downtown in LA, about 4 blocks from Skid Row, but also 4 blocks from a renaissance that was going on in downtown Los Angeles. And I thought the juxtaposition of what was happening on a sociological level was really interesting. And so I thought, well, since the Renaissance is happening and architects are sort of the geniuses of how this place is going to look, then let's start killing some of them off and see what happens. But my character Sam Carver, I wanted to be. He's got his problems. He's a bit of a transplant too. He never had a terrific relationship with his father. His mother now has Alzheimer's, so he's struggling with that. He's a lone soul, but he doesn't think that there's not any sort of redeeming qualities out there. It's just every time he finds one, it doesn't last long. So he continues to struggle with, okay, I'm not going to be one of these stereotypical, button down, cop guys who don't say much and reticent, but I'm very self-reflective at the same time. But I want to pull some meaning out of life. I want something to go beyond the crimes I'm seeing, and so that's what he's struggling with interiorly as he's going from case to case.
Jeffrey, I'm curious, I know that in My Detective, you spent a lot of time sort of inside the head of Dylan Cross as your female killer. And obviously, Sam Carver, is a man and the hero of the series. What do you find? What do you have a preference in terms of writing male or female characters, and how do you find it different between doing so?
I think in My Detective, it's told in alternating chapters between Carver, and then the next chapter will be Dylan, and they just alternate to the end of the books. The male characters, I was a lot easier to do, but I like the exploration of the female character, the sensitivities that the male would bring, the perspective that a male would bring. You really have to force yourself to invert or flip-flop or come at it in a complete different way, because it's not that way in that particular mind. And I found that a challenge, but an awfully fun one to try to work at. And I've tried to that My Detective was more interior between both of them. Last Dance is much more plot driven, but I've tried to bring in a couple of more female characters who stand out a little bit more. I find it fascinating to write about because it's half the planet, and sometimes we don't always understand what the other half of the planet is thinking and what their motivations and things are. So
yeah, it's interesting because I sort of had a strangely opposite experience, because I wrote The Deep, Deep Snow, which is narrated in the first person with a female character, Shelby Lake. And then my next standalone thriller coming out in March is called Infinite. And it's also in the first person, but it's in the first person from a male perspective. It's another Dylan character. His name is Dylan Moran, a male character. And, I was saying to my wife, Marcia, it was, as I was writing Infinite, I said it's sort of a strange thing. And yet I find I'm struggling more getting Dylan right as a male narrator than I was with Shelby as a female character. I don't know what that says about me, but it was an interesting experience, because I felt like in some ways that negotiation process of getting Shelby to trust me and let me tell her story somehow felt easier and smoother than with Dylan Moran. And Dylan Moran is a character that's got sort of more hard edges and is more closed off, and it may have been partly that, but it felt like it was a little bit of a harder process to get Dylan to be willing to sort of share his emotional perspective.
Well, I know in Shelby Lake, I mean, I think the brilliance in that character is she's accessible right away from the opening scene about how she comes into the world, basically, and you have a. She lets you in, and there's a sense of trust there, and you get that she's going to make mistakes, she's going to do things, but it's going to be an earnestness that does it. And that I think when you create a character like that, the reader is drawn there. So you did this time with a woman character, but the reader is certainly drawn to Shelby like right away.
Thank you.
I don't think there's not any warm-up process to her. Which is really good.
So for both of you guys, and since you're both writing characters from the female perspective, did you guys give the books to anybody to read before they came out, just to make sure that like you got the voice right, or that the female characters were kind of read as authentic? Let's start with Brian.
My wife Marcia is always my first reader on every book, and she's tougher and more ruthless than any editor I've dealt with in the publishing world, which is great. That's exactly what each book needs. She always offers exactly that kind of insight on whether the character is jumping off the page and whether I'm getting a woman's perspective right in those characters, and we'll have we'll have sort of knockdown drag out arguments about what on particular scenes, and then once I acknowledge that she's right and I'm wrong, we're good to go. So.
Right. Yeah, for me it's similar. My wife Claire's definitely my best reader, and especially if it comes to a woman character or anything that she feels is going too far in a direction that it doesn't need to, or off base on even though it's fiction, there are certain constraints. Believability is, once you create that imaginary world, you still have to be believable in that world, and if you stray outside of that, then you're in trouble. So I think my wife is a good reader that way for me.
And then, so Brian, I read in an interview that you said that you thought that this book was kind of one of your most personal, which is interesting if you're writing it kind of from a female's perspective. Can you tell us a little bit about why this one's so personal for you?
Yeah, there were a lot of elements that went into this book that have a real emotional core. I mean, I think between this and Thief River Falls, those are probably the two books that really they come closest for me to exactly what sort of emotional thriller I want to write. And I mentioned that The Deep, Deep Snow was inspired by a real case in Minnesota. And as I say, when I came up with the concept, the case had not yet been solved. And unfortunately, after that, it was solved, and the resolution is what it too often was a particularly horrible and egregious end to that case. And I went into it wanting to take a different approach. I mean, I've written a lot of thrillers and a lot of mysteries at this point, but the strange thing is I find that as I get older and the more books that I write, the more I'm looking to try to find mysteries and characters where the violence is not kind of at the heart of the story. And I think that's very much the case in The Deep, Deep Snow. It ultimately really is not a story about violence. It's a story about what I refer to as the well-meaning traveler, and the destination for the well-meaning traveler is hell, because that's where the road of good intentions so often leads. And that was the kind of story I wanted to tell in this book, and I knew going into it that as a result of that, it was going to really strike to the heart of the kinds of choices people make, and the kinds of weaknesses they have, even in the midst of their strengths and ambitions. And so I just felt that this one really it got to what I wanted to talk about in terms of characters that don't always do the right thing, even when they're trying so hard to do the right thing. And sometimes the consequences of that can be truly tragic.
And so you mentioned before it being based on a case, a real case, and that the case had gotten solved around the time that you finished the manuscript. Did the resolution of the case have any impact on the story for you?
No, it really didn't, because as I said, I wanted to take the resolution of the mystery in a very, very different kind of way. And unfortunately, the resolution of the true life mystery was there was simply nothing but tragedy in that. So.
And then Jeffrey, I read in one of the reviews for your book, they said the Sam Carver series is a unique blend of crime noir and espionage, as if Raymond Chandler and John le Carré had a baby. And so you mentioned that some of your kind of noir, you mentioned that
Pardon
some
me?
of the noir. No, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
You
I'm
mentioned
still trying to get that mental image in my.
So you mentioned that some of your kind of early noir inspirations were films as opposed to kind of books. Can you talk a little bit about kind of where the espionage elements came from? Did some of that come from kind of just your journalism background, or are you a big kind of spy fiction fan too?
No, a lot of that came from my journalism background, and experiences I had overseas, and just being close to that kind of thing. Like when and two instances stand out where you can be in another place and really see a country by what's unfolding before you. And in Serbia, I think it was in 2000 or 1999, it was days before Slobodan Milosevic, who's known as the Butcher of the Balkans, was going to be arrested by war crimes prosecutors from The Hague. And a couple of us were sitting in who would then be the new prime minister of Serbia, Zoran Đinđić's office. And we were talking, we were getting leave, and it was a Friday. And he said, "What are you guys doing?" And I was living in Rome at the time. And I said, "Well, I'm flying back to Rome." And a couple of other reporters said where they were going. And he said, "If I were you, I wouldn't fly back to Rome this weekend." And on Saturday morning, they raided Milosevic's compound, and had I been in Rome, I would have been in a lot of trouble. But then play that out. So then at that point, Milosevic is the loser, Đinđić is the winner, and then 2 years later, unbeknownst to him, an assassin's bullet would kill Zoran Đinđić while he was prime minister right outside his office. So that kind of intrigue and things in the foreign reporting world always fascinated me, and you'd see it in real time. And I was able to borrow a lot of scenes from that I've used in different books.
So a couple questions from the crowd that have popped up. Brian, Cami wants to know, will there be a second book featuring Shelby from the Deep, Deep Snow?
That's a good question. I'm actually, I'm in the home stretch of a follow-up book to the Deep, Deep Snow right now. I'm going to be turning it in by the end of the year, but it's not really a pure sequel. It's really not a quote unquote series book. And yet it clearly emerges out of the narrative of the Deep, Deep Snow. So, but Shelby doesn't really appear in the book, or does she? So I won't say more than that, but it is clearly a follow-up book, and I think anyone who reads The Deep, Deep Snow will feel that it's the natural story to be told next, but it's not sort of a classic part of the series.
And so kind of going with that for both of you guys, so how do you know if an idea is, when you're working on something, how do you know if an idea is good enough to kind of carry a series, or if you think it's just going to be just a standalone novel? Jeffrey, let's start with you.
Um, that's a really good question, because when I was writing my detective, I up until maybe the last few chapters, I didn't think it was going to be. I thought it might just be a standalone book about the relationship between killer and the detective. And then as I got to the end, I wanted to end a certain way where it could go on. And then when the publisher Blackstone read the book, they asked if I could do another book with to keep Sam Carver going. And at that point, I think it had dawned on me that, yeah, this is kind of cool. I like Sam Carver. I don't want him to go anywhere yet. And the series provides you another opportunity. And Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, but you don't have to say goodbye to a character that you end up spending a lot of time with, and you don't have to come back to him all the time, but he or she is always there for you.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, ultimately, I think the real question with regard to can something make a series are there natural stories that continue for that character, and will that character continue to evolve and change and grow in interesting ways? I mean, people will ask me, how long do you intend to keep the Stride series going? And I'll say, well, as long as Stride himself as a character can continue to change and evolve and stay interesting for the reader, then there are going to be more stories to tell. I think there are certain standalones that, by the nature of the character and the plot, really aren't likely to turn into a series, and you're looking at a particular character that's undergoing sort of one dramatic moment in their life, and that's really the essence of the story that you want to tell. And it would sort of feel strange to go back to that, and some of that is, if you're looking at a police character, obviously there's sort of a natural progression of stories to be told around what that person does. If you're talking about a private citizen, it would seem strange if somebody that would continue to have these sort of wildly dramatic things happening to them in their life. You sort of struggle with the credibility of that. So in most cases, I think if you're writing a novel that's sort of focused on what one dramatic element in a person's life, then it's more likely to sort of end with that book. But as Jeffrey says, it's really emotional. I mean, when I write a standalone novel and I kind of turn the page at the end, it's hard because you get so emotionally connected to those characters, and they're such a part of your life that it really is. There's a mourning process in saying goodbye and feeling like you're not going to be revisiting those characters.
So Trisha wants to know, how do you research for an action-based thriller? How is your approach? Has your approach had to change so you can both put your own stamp on a series or a novel without making it kind of unreasonable? So I guess it kind of boils down to kind of, where does that believability in kind of an action thriller, like where's the line for that? Let's start with Brian.
Well, that's a great Jason Bourne question, and you're sort of, you can get away with having a more fun in a Jason Bourne thriller than you might in sort of a more reality based is not necessarily the right word, but it's sort of more grounded in ordinary life that you would have in a Jonathan Stride novel or something like The Deep Deep Snow. When I was working on Jason Bourne, the first words I put on my whiteboard were "have fun," and so I think you give yourself permission as a writer to spin the characters a little wilder and take the plot in some directions that are a little more extravagant and fun, because that's part of the nature of the series. And you sort of have to just kind of catch that right balance of not taking it so far that it becomes sort of caricature-ish or superhero-ish, and yet at the same time you can do things with characters and story ideas that that you couldn't do in another book. I mean, the character of Miss Shirley in The Bourne Evolution is was just such a fun character to create, because she's so wonderfully evil, and she's up there on the roof of the skyscraper in New York doing yoga positions on the on the edge of the roof. It's just great fun stuff like that you can do in in sort of an action adrenaline thriller that you're not going to do in sort of a more standard police procedural.
And how about you, Jeffrey? Especially since you said, since, a lot of the stuff that's kind of in the books is actually based on real stuff that you witnessed. So how do you know, like, how far you can kind of push that and heighten it for a thriller?
Yeah, for me, and especially in this book, I really like engaging with what's happening in the world immediately around me, because I just think putting your characters into a sense of reality for your reader, even though it's imagination, and you're pushing the parameters of what reality is, but the seeds of reality are there, so the reader can latch onto that, and then you can take them to where you want to go based on the believability you're creating in your story. So for me, one of the characters was he was a former Russian spy, although he's a bit elusive about admitting that, who became a billionaire TV producer or a movie producer in Hollywood. That's loosely based on the story of a billionaire movie producer in Hollywood who was at one time an Israeli spy. And he makes great blockbuster movies and also quiet little movies. And then another character in the book is a sort of early 50s woman Russian assassin who's been through the Cold War and now is in the New World, and she's trying to navigate that. So all these exist. They have their sort of their mirror equals out there in the real world, but these are tweaked characters to the imagination to kind of fit that.
Yeah. It's nice to hear you say kind of wanting to reflect the role. We've had so many people now that kind of Russia has been in the news for, much of the last 4 years of the news cycle. We've had lots of people coming in and kind of asking for kind of books set in Russia and kind of Cold War-ish stuff that just people kind of aren't doing anymore. So it's nice to have kind of a book that kind of deals with.
Well, I think that was one of the things that why this became such a plot for the book, is I was really intrigued by what Vladimir Putin was doing and the power he was having and how that was playing in American politics. I mean, some of the book deals with the hacking of the election back in 2016 and how those operatives worked and what it was like and what they were after. So, and I found that that was part when you're researching, you're basically reading headlines that are happening in real time. So it was easy, but I found a lot of people asking me about the Cold War element of the book.
And so as you're using kind of stuff that's kind of current headline, things like that, how do you balance kind of being able to do stuff that, because, generally kind of a book comes out a year after you've written it. How do you tackle the book not kind of reading dated or kind of having moved on from those news cycle stuff by time it's released?
Yeah, well, well, go ahead, Jeffrey.
No, go ahead, because I'm struggling with that. Go ahead.
Well, it is, I mean, sometimes you're really trying to hit it on the head, and sometimes it just sort of works out fortuitously. I mean, I remember I was working on my previous Jonathan Stride novel, Alter Ego, and the one before, Funeral for a Friend, and I'd actually had the plot concept in mind for several years, and finally got around to getting it into the Stride series. But it really focused on the idea. The concept of Alter Ego is that a film is being made of one of Stride's earlier cases, and so he has to deal with his alter ego, this actor who is actually playing him in the movie, and the actor turns out to have some very dark secrets that Stride ends up exposing. And I turned in the manuscript for Alter Ego, and I think it was 2 weeks later that the whole Harvey Weinstein thing blew up in the press, and so I had my editor on the phone saying, "Well, did you know something?" And that was one where it just it was totally fortuitous that it ended up sort of being the first thriller of the Me Too generation, but it really wasn't something that I'd planned. It just worked out that way. Whereas Bourne was kind of the opposite, that I was kind of making a strategic strategic gamble with Bourne that privacy issues and technology issues seem to be sort of on an escalating arc. And I was thinking about sort of a social media software that would claim to be sort of predicting what you're going to do next, when in fact it's manipulating what you're going to do next. And the timing just worked out, magnificently. That essentially that's sort of been the whole conversation about social media this year.
Yeah, and I had similar luck with the Last Dance, because Putin's not going anywhere, at least for a while, and these intriguing things that are happening continue to happen, and through this past election and forward. But I think also to save yourself from feeling that it's a dated story is the story that you're actually telling within that story. You have the larger backdrop of where your characters are moving and what's happening and the political intrigue or whatever. But the essence and the core of the story that is embedded in that, if that's interesting and that's moving, then you can put that against any backdrop. And that's what I tried to do, is make sure every time I'm approaching something that's topical, what are the universal themes in that won't matter if this is good. And if you went back and read, Le Carré novel now from the 60s, it still holds up. The Cold War in that version isn't the same, but the characters, the drama, how he sees life is still extremely relevant.
It was interesting when we were chatting with Michael Connolly a couple of weeks ago. He was talking about, so when he usually turns his books in like, I think he said like May or June, and they come out around November. And he's always able to kind of include some of those real life things. So he was actually able, while he was writing it, to go back and actually have COVID in this new book that just came out like 2 weeks ago. So it's so crazy to hear him be able to talk about kind of being able to work that stuff in, where, most people, if they're going to address it or not, it would potentially be like next year before we would see that in any books.
That's an interesting thing, and I'll throw this open to Brian. Something like COVID that's so permeating, so universal, so suffocating to all our lives, how do you approach that how does a writer approach something so enveloping that you make it original? Because the person picking it up said, COVID book, I live COVID life, I don't need to, I think that's a real challenge for both a nonfiction writer and a novelist.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, honestly, I look at COVID and I kind of like, keep that away from fiction. I mean, it is such a depressing overlay to our entire, lives right now, that, my God, who would want to read fiction based on that right now? I've been wrong about that in the past. Back in the early 2000s, I felt like the last thing you wanted to do was write, terrorism thrillers after 2001, when, it's like, oh my God, this is everywhere in the news. Who on earth would want to see, more stories about that? And yet people were out there eating them up. So maybe we'll see, a whole genre of pandemic thrillers coming out in the next couple of years. But for me, honestly, I don't want to have anything to do with that. They're in the second Bourne book that I just turned in a couple of weeks ago. There's a couple oblique references to COVID, sort of like, oh yeah, that was in the past, so that people can kind of say, yeah, we're done with that.
Yeah, I did actually. We must be on osmosis here, because I did the same thing for the follow-up to Last Dance. I got to a point when we were just living in this COVID box, and I thought, well, should I write a COVID chapter? The book was pretty much done, and I started fooling around with it. I said, no, it's not going to work. It's too. But at the same point, the book was unfolding while it was happening, so I made one or two just very glancing references to it, so the reader would know, okay, he gets this, or this is in this time, but we're not going to spend a lot of time on it.
Yeah. What have you found, Jeffrey, in terms of how, this year and how COVID, how has that affected your writing? Did that come through?
Yeah. How did it affect I think I write really early in the morning before I go into work. So I'll get up at 5:30 and write till 7:30. I can't work on the book after that because I'm either editing or doing, journalism. So it didn't really change my writing that much. Although it made me feel. I know when I was writing the next book after Last Dance, there's a feeling of you're insular, right? You're in yourself a lot more. So I think your characters, and Sam Carver's already pretty insular, so I think your characters take on the four walls that you live in with this virus, the constraints of that life become maybe subconsciously embedded in them. But as far as my actual work day, it didn't change it that much. How about you?
Yeah, what I found is it has been harder this year to sort of lose reality and immerse myself in the alternate creative reality. I mean, there has been such an overlay of stress and frustration and anger, whether it's the pandemic or politics. I mean, it's just been such a perfect storm of sort of everything kind of going to hell this year that I found it was harder to shovel that all aside and really sort of get inside the emotional heart of my characters. It just felt like more I was kind of swimming through jello this year as opposed to just sort of being able to smoothly go inside these fictional characters. It was just harder to push the real world away.
Well, I think that's because the real world had such a grip on us so relentlessly, and so 24/7. It didn't let us go, and the narrative was more compelling than most novels you're going to read. I mean, that's a cliche. That's
horror novels.
No, but it's like every day, and then you had the domestic part of it. Then you had the politics, and you had, then you had the White House part of it. Then you had the international stuff, and then you had COVID, and then just all these things had their own interlocking and then separate narratives going on. So you're right. You often feel overwhelmed. I'd sit at the news desk sometimes, and now we're all working out of our home, and just the level of and velocity of copy going across your desk from around the world is incredible, and it's not letting up.
Yeah, and we've heard kind of similarly just from readers too. We had a customer in the store today who was saying like, oh, this pandemic must be good for bookstores because everybody has lots of time to sit around and read. And it's definitely not a good time for bookstores, but I know there are a lot of people that just don't have kind of the brain capacity to kind of sit down and immerse themselves in fiction, like you said, because there's just so much other stuff that's kind of got a grip on us that it's hard to just kind of shut your brain off for an hour or two and just kind of lose yourself in fiction. I mean, it's getting better, and we definitely have seen, kind of people turning to, kind of thrillers and classics and stuff like that to kind of do that. But it's definitely been a hard year for, I think, just kind of brain capacity in general. So we have a couple more questions before we head out. So you guys talked a little bit about kind of writing process. So Bryce wants to know, do you have any little tics or quirks when you write? Do you listen to music? Do you have like a special coffee cup, anything like that? Any writing rituals? Let's start with Brian.
Quirks and tics in the writing process. Oh, that's a good question. Well, over the years, I've tended to change my process a lot. I've switched the rooms I've written in. I've switched the devices that I use. I've switched styles. Again, now I'm doing a lot more writing out loud. I bought myself a stand-up desk, so I do most of my writing standing up now. So it's like I don't like to kind of get locked into one particular routine. So I'm kind of always changing my environment a little bit, which kind of keeps me feeling a little bit spontaneous about things. Other than that, no, I can't listen to music. I prefer to have, as much as I can, dead silence, which when you have 3 cats is typically not the, not the way the world works, but you do what you can.
I tried music, jazz, or like classical, really soft, but I couldn't do it. I find my big thing is silence. I need quiet, and if I don't have it, I'll make excuses for making sure I need to get it. So that means I'm not writing because I'm looking to make silence. So once I have silence, I try to just say, okay, from this amount of time, I'm going to just work no matter what the result is. I'm just going to keep working. And that's harder to do than I'm saying right now, and especially if you don't have silence. But for me, it's not so much ticks as just, if there's quiet, I feel comfortable in that silence, and then I can go.
I'm curious whether that's a journalist thing too, because I remember I remember hearing John Sanford talk about the fact that he kind of allocates a certain amount of time. I think he writes in the evening, but he has a very sort of rigid schedule that he follows in getting it done. I'm just curious if that structure is sort of if that feels like a comfortable approach for a journalist.
I think it does in the at least for me, it's that block of time. It's like when you come back at 4 o'clock to the newsroom, and you've got a notebook full of notes, and the deadline is at 6 o'clock for the first print run. You just have to get it done. Of course, this isn't like that, but that time element helps. And then if I let it slip after, then I go to the job, then I'm, coming home at 7, and I'm just looking at copy and stuff all day. I won't have the energy or the imagination to go back to it in the same way. So I make sure, maybe it's desperation. I make sure those 2 hours work, because I may not get them the rest of the day.
So 2 more questions before we go. What is something that you have read recently that you love? Let's start with Brian.
Oh, well, I have kind of odd eclectic taste. I don't read much. I don't read much fiction anymore. When you write suspense all day long, it's kind of hard to lose yourself in somebody else's suspense novel. So I mostly read nonfiction, history, biographies, things like that. I'm in the middle of a biography, the 2-part biography of Frank Sinatra right now, and it's fascinating watching that combination of genius and talent and just pure son of a bitchedness. Which is just a fascinating combination of the human spirit. So I learn a lot from that. That's mostly what I read now. Although right now I've been doing more fiction when I exercise and listening to audiobooks, and I'm listening to the dramatization of Dracula right now, and I'm absolutely loving it. I'd never actually read Dracula before. So.
How about you, Jeffrey?
I just went through another short stories of Ernest Hemingway, sort of reread some of that not too long ago. But the book I just finished, and it came out years ago, but it was We Need to Talk About Kevin by Lionel Schreiber. And I thought, wow, talk about getting into the interior of a character and staying with a mother and her serial killer son, and the dynamics in that. It was really a terrific bit of prose.
Awesome. And last question. I always feel bad asking people this, but everybody always wants to know, because you have just released books, but what are you working on next, or what's coming up next for you? Let's go with Jeffrey first this time.
The book I am just finishing up is the third one in the Sam Carver series, and it takes place. The theme behind that is the background theme is global warming, because it's raining all the time in LA, and that's sort of sacrilege. And it's about that. It's about race in America, and it's about the art world, so those are the three sort of dynamics, and I'm just finishing up that.
Awesome. And how about you, Brian?
Yeah, I'm keeping busy. My next standalone thriller called Infinite comes out on March 1, and we just got a starred review from Kirkus for that, called it a dizzying delight, and that's well phrased, because Infinite is the most unusual story I've ever told. It's really, really different, but I love this book. I can't wait to have it out there. I just turned in the second of my Jason Bourne books, The Bourne Treachery, so that's going to be out in July, and then I'm in the home stretch of the follow-up book to The Deep, Deep Snow right now.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for joining us tonight. If you guys caught the live stream midway through, we have been chatting with Brian Freeman, who just released The Deep, Deep Snow, and Jeffrey Fleishman, who just released The Last Dance. If you missed any part of the chat, YouTube will archive it and you'll be able to watch it from the beginning once we are done. If you guys are local to Houston, we wanted to mention, if you haven't been in, the store is now open for browsing. No appointment needed. We are limiting the number of people that are in the store at a time. But you can come in. Obviously, masks are required. We understand not everybody is comfortable kind of getting out and about yet, so we're still available for mail order, and we're also still doing curbside pickup too if you don't want to come into the store. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It was great to chat with you.
Thank you, John. Jeffrey,
Thank
thanks
you,
for
John. Thank you, Brian. Take care. Happy
care.
holidays.